I'm Ken Tate. I'm the Director of Engagement and External Relations for the Department of Computer Science. It's my honor to welcome each of you to the LabCorp Leadership and Technology Speaker Series. So this series has, for those of you who may not be aware, and students rotate in and out pretty quickly, this series has actually been up and running in one form or another for about 15 years now. We're getting close to 100 speakers. We've had some really good speakers, and we just want to say to LabCorp, we thank you for your sponsorship of this series and allowing it to go on. We have a 3-year commitment from them. We're in year 2. So we invite you to come back for more of our talks. A couple of announcements. Now would be a great time to silence cell phones or anything that may be a distraction during the talk itself. And also just to tell you that we are videotaping this in addition to live stream. So if you want to go back and check it out, it will be available on our YouTube channel. So I've said we've been providing this series because the whole world of leadership in technology is quite unique. And we look at different topics month to month. And this month we are turning our attention to how technology has impacted the world of entertainment, specifically as it relates to video processing. So tonight we're honored to welcome with us Scott Labrozzi. And Scott's widely recognized as an expert in the streaming media industry, transforming the domain with his more than 30 years experience in this field. He has multiple patents to his credit. He's authored new industry standards, and he has been awarded 2 technical Emmys. So, I mean, it's a pretty big deal. So, he's currently the VP of Core Media Technology and an engineering fellow at Disney Streaming. He and his team are responsible for building the organization's live and video on demand processing solutions, which are currently in use on ESPN+, Hulu, Star, and Disney+. He's also actively involved in various research and development activities across the entire Walt Disney Company related to the advancement in media processing. And last but not least, he's one of us. He is a Wolfpack graduate, and we're always glad to welcome our fellow Wolfpack alumni back home. He has an MS in computer engineering from right here at NC State. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our very special guest speaker tonight, Scott Labrozzi. Scott?
Well, thank you for the nice introduction, and it is truly an honor to be here in this glorious facility. When I think about when I started my academic work here, this didn't exist. So it was, as it was said, some 30 plus years ago. So I thought I'd start tonight talking about, like where do I start? Well, as just stated, an alumni. I was finishing off my graduate degree here in the fall of 1991, and I was considering, what am I going to do in my career, right? So I had a steep background in object-oriented programming. I was doing hardware-based design with Verilog, et cetera, and I was interviewing all sorts of different places. So for example, I was down in Charlotte talking to banking companies about transactional software. I was up in the Northeast talking to military-based companies about applications there. I remember going off to the east where Corning Fiber Optic has a plant near Wilmington, North Carolina, and it was all about control, machine control, and type of manufacturing facility. And there was also a local place here called Sun Microsystems that was based in California, but they had about 70 engineers here locally that were transitioning from graphics into video. So I was thinking about my interview with Sun, and I knew that they were starting to do this video compression thing, but I didn't know anything about video compression. And so I said, well, let me go to my advisor and ask my advisor, hey, Dr. Vandenbelt, do you know anything about video compression? And fortuitously, he had this magazine, and I mean this one, because if you look down, you can't see it in the back, but it's dated from 1991. He had just gotten it like 3 weeks before I went and asked him, and it was about video compression. Now, ultimately, I doubt it was the fact that I crammed about video compression about the day before I went to an interview. It was more of my object-oriented experience that landed me the job, but that's essentially where I started my career. Now, so where has this taken me? Now, I think we just had a summary about the various different places and things that I've done through my career. I've started 2 startup companies. All of this stuff, by the way, has been local here to North Carolina. So I've been working here in the Research Triangle Park for the last 30-something years. So I've started 2 companies. I've had to date over 30 patents issued, developed multiple industry standards, the honors with the Emmys I'll talk about a little bit later on, and I've been loving every single minute of it. Now, I say this, it's not in a humble way. I am trying to impress on you that when I started my career 30 years ago, I never would have imagined that I would still be doing something very similar, video processing, and continuing to have a pretty big impact in that space throughout that time. Now, tonight's talk we're going to talk about a lot about video compression and video coding. But before I get into some of those specifics, I thought to talk a little bit about, so exactly how do we compress video? What is the act of compressing? So the first thing that we must understand when we're trying to compress video, make things smaller, is that if we can leverage what we know about how we see, how we observe, then we can do a better job in terms of making things smaller. And so we do that through the study of the human visual system, the HVS. And so by that study of that, we can learn things about like what we're sensitive to and what we're not sensitive to, and take advantage of that in terms of how we compress data. Now, even though most of my talk's going to be from the 1990s and on, taking advantage of this predates even video compression. So the analog television standard, analog TV, for example, took advantage of the fact that we were very sensitive to the black and white signals more so than color. And it used the technique of simply basically separating out black and white from chroma, from color, and then subsampling chroma as a technique to sort of reduce the signal of information. So, but there are a lot of other ways and other things that we see or that impacts our HVS system that we can take advantage of. So for example, contrast and noise and the frequency space, et cetera. Now when we think about compression itself, there's a lot of ways that we go about it. One thing we can use is just use sort of data, exploit data correlations, and we'll see that in a moment. But because we're actually talking about pictures and video, we can also take advantage of correlations in the spatial domain and the temporal domain. We also use something called prediction encoding in encoding and in compression. So prediction basically is a fact of making a prediction about something that might occur and then calculating your error or your difference. And if your prediction is really good or really close, well, there's going to be very little error to actually have to distribute over the wire. Okay? Now, the fact that we have to compress data for video is as a ramification that video is so massive, it's so large. So in order to fit it either on a disk or across the wire of a network, we have to make it smaller. And so in order to do so, we have to do it, unfortunately, with loss. And there's an element of compression that deals with rate control, which regulates how much loss we're willing to accept when we compress. So now I'm going to go back to 1992. And we're going to start talking about the evolution of video codecs through the decades. And I'm going to intersperse a little bit of my career through this as we go along. So there was a joint standards group called the Joint Photoelectric Expert Group. It was founded in the late 80s, and they were targeting a particular application, which was the compression of still images. They ultimately created a standard. They named it after themselves, so JPEG. You probably all still use JPEG today, very popular, although it's evolved through the years. This is where it first came from. And again, it was targeting a very specific application of still images. Now, because it's still images, it's really, for the most part, first off, only making use of spatial correlations. We're not talking about video yet, okay? And to do so, it leveraged a 20-year-old transform that had been around for many years that was developed by Nasser Ahmed, called the Discrete Cosine transform, or simply the DCT. And the thing that the DCT does is it would transform from the spatial data from the spatial domain into the frequency domain. And one of the reasons why that's important to compression is because, as I stated on the previous slide, our HSV system, the way we see things, we have different sensitivities in that frequency domain. And so by transferring from spatial into the frequency domain, we're able to take advantage of those and apply a technique called quantization. So quantization essentially allows us to remove some of the frequency information selectively so that we maybe perceive it with less loss. Okay? So not only do we have this opportunity to take things from the spatial to the frequency domain, we then can take these quantized DC coefficients and compact them even further by using a technique called entropy encoding. Now, the JPEG baseline algorithm specifies Huffman encoding. Now, Unfortunately, this talk tonight, I could probably go on hours to do a deep dive in technical compression, but hopefully maybe through some of your undergraduate or your graduate studies, you might understand what Huffman-based encoding actually is. So if I look at a Jpeg encoder from a very high level, it's actually pretty simple. It has some very simple basic building blocks. An image is decomposed into a set of blocks, 8 by 8 blocks. Those things go through a DCT. Those things are then quantized, and then they're entropy or Huffman encoding, and that's the result. It's as simple as that. Now, when I started at Sun Microsystems, they already had a Jpeg encoder. And they came up to me, one of my first tasks, they said to me, Scott, go make it better, make it more efficient. And although I don't know what I looked like at the time, I probably was like a deer in the headlights. I was probably like, I'm sorry, make it better. This is a standard. What are you expecting of me? And this turned out to be my personal first lesson in terms of video compression. You see, compression is an art form to some degree, because the specifications, whether it's JPEG or the other specs we're going to talk about later this evening, they don't actually tell you how to compress. The syntax itself, the specification, is a bitstream syntax, and essentially tells you, if you have this syntax, you have this bitstream, how do you take that and how do you decode it? Now, sort of indirectly, it will tell us a bit about the tool set, but again, it doesn't actually tell you how about going to do it. So in some regard, compression, the act of compression, is like art, and the art that goes into compression is often very highly controlled IP of companies. I contrast that against decompression. If I have something that's encoded, you take the specification, you apply a set of rules, and it becomes decoded. Not to say that there can't be some type of special optimization in terms of processing that applies art to decoding, but on the compression side, it's highly, highly art-centric. So again, going back to this task of mine, make this thing better. Well, when I think about the JPEG pipeline, there wasn't a lot of choices here. But one piece of the pipeline that I touched on, the Huffman encoding, it basically utilizes statistical data in terms of how it's going to compactly compress the data sequences that are in front of it. Now, JPEG itself provides a standard set of tables that you can use, but it also allows one to provide custom tables. And so this was the approach that I took to make the JPEG implementation that we had even better. It was an act of basically, after all the data was quantized, analyze it for statistical characteristics, and then determine basically what is the optimal Huffman table that you can use for that, and then provide that in band and stream. Not quite rocket science, but it was certainly my first lesson into sort of the art of compressing. Now, I've just talked about JPEG. Now, JPEG is a still image format. It's not yet video. Now, one can take a sequence of JPEG images one after the other and construct a video from it. In fact, motion JPEG is simply that. It's one JPEG image after the other. But even doing so, the only thing we're accomplishing there is for the most part, taking into account the spatial redundancy of images. We're not yet taking anything into account about the motion. Now, if you think about me here this evening walking around and a camera pointed at me, this background is not moving. The video is going, it's going maybe 30, 60 frames per second. Nothing behind me is changing. And even myself, I'm mostly the same as I move across the room. So when we think about video compression, we start to think not only about spatial correlations, but also temporal correlations. So it was also the case in the 1980s that a different standards group was formed to look at a mechanism, a compression standard that would be able to deliver video over a emerging technology that was happening. It was called ISDN, and they wanted to try and effectively get video at a data rate that could go onto these public telephone networks. And ultimately what was standardized was something called H.261. Now, it was actually first published in the late 80s, but it took many, many years, not in fact until 1993, for it to actually become, I'm sorry, not 1993. Oh yeah, 1993, right, to become standardized. Now, if we take a look at H.261 as a video compression pipeline, for the most part, it looks very identical to JPEG that we saw a moment ago. It's got a DCT, it's got a quantizer, it's got an entropy encoder, okay? And for the most part, frames called iframes, that's essentially what they do, those steps. But to start to introduce basically motion prediction, motion compensation, all frames go through basically a reverse of the encode. It basically has inside of the encoder a decoder that basically inverses the quantization, inverses the DCT to get something we call reconstructed or reference frames. And by doing so, there's another frame type called p-frames, and p-frames basically are predictive frames. This allows us for a particular p-frame to look at the previous frame and determine some motion correlation between the two. Look for blocks in one frame, the p-frame, that happened in the previous frame, and find one that happens to be really close. And if we find one that's really close, we can find the difference. The difference forms an error, and what we have to do is encode the error and the motion vector. Now, this being the case, this H.261 being essentially maybe one of the first video compression technologies, it was fairly limited. The resolutions were fixed. The prediction only was in the forward direction and only of one frame. But even as simple as it is, if we look at over the last 30 years in terms of video coding, they all basically share the same type of structure that was developed here almost 30 to 40 years ago. Now, it's the case in our space when we look at as you'll hear through my talk this evening, that in many, many cases, the evolution of video was because of a particular application. So I talked about H.261 in a moment. Why did they focus on that? There's this new emerging technology about ISDN that was going to be for the phone networks, and they said, let's come up with a video standard for that. And again, as you'll hear through my talk, you'll hear lots of examples of just that. So the next example I'd like to talk about is something called, well, we're going to call it MPEG, but it came from another standards group called the Motion Pictures Export Group. And they were targeting a particular application, was like, all right, how do we take media, audio and video and data, and put it on this thing that was a storage medium at the time? So I'm looking at the age group of this audience, and I'm like, do you guys know what a CD, well, you probably know what CDs are because of music, but that's basically the thing that they had. And that CD, in terms of its data rate, was around 1.5 megabits per second. And so they were trying to come up with a standard that basically will allow video and audio, et cetera, to be able to be compressed at a rate that would fit on this physical disk medium. And so MPEG-1 was the result. Much like JPEG, the Motion Pictures Expert Group called their standard after their name, so that's where MPEG, MPEG-1 comes from. It's very, very similar to H.261, although it didn't have the resolution restrictions. But one thing that was pretty interesting about the evolution here is that they thought, you know, if we rearrange the frames, like I've got a frame here and another frame that happens in time, if we rearrange the time that we process these things, we can actually do this technique which is called both forward and backwards prediction, which means a given frame can be used from something that's going to happen in the future. There are some tools inside of MPEG-1 as well. Now, before I continue to the next topic, I want to ask this audience. Now, I'm a father, and one of my boys happens to be back in the back there. Have your parents ever come to you and said, you guys have it easy? When I was your age, when I had to go to school, I had to walk both ways. It was uphill. It was in the snow. I didn't have shoes, right? You guys have it so easy. I can see Ken here smiling, so maybe he's actually said that to his children. So to put that in perspective, the reason why I'm mentioning that is when you guys think about video today compared to what video was in the 90s, you guys, man, you're living the dream, man. You've got HD video, UHD video, the kind of video you have on your phone. That was not the case when we think about what's in the 90s. Back then, we were dealing with standard definition TV. And what is standard definition TV? Well, to give you some context, it's 6 times smaller than HD and 24 times smaller than UHD. And not only was it SD television, it was analog SD television. Imagine how horrific that might have looked, and it certainly did. So we had a case that we figured out how to take media and put it on disk, but our television at the time was analog broadcast, analog cable, and they wanted to try and improve upon that. So again, the use of an application to drive an evolution in video coding applied here as well. The industry was looking at ways to take and convert television broadcasts from the analog domain to the digital domain. Now, while MPEG-1 could have potentially been used in some form from that, there was one really hard challenge, among others, but one really significant one, and that is that TV, the signal of a TV, was something called interlaced. And interlaced basically is the fact that a particular video frame that we think of, an image, was actually not in itself by itself. It was actually split into two, so two halves, and it was spatially and temporally disparate from one another. So it was something like this. And the MPEG-1, trying to use MPEG-1 against something like that, produced pretty horrific compression efficiencies. So ultimately, MPEG-2 was developed to address those particular problems. So now, while MPEG-2 was optimized for this new thing, digital television, and it was optimized over managed networks. So managed means your cable provider or your satellite provider. There was this new thing, this new revolutionary thing that was happening in the 90s and was being commercialized. Does anyone want to take a guess at what that was? Something major, you probably don't think about it today, is the internet. Right? Can you imagine your life before the internet? Well, I remember when the www became a thing and when the internet became a thing. However, this is not your internet. This is your parents' internet, right? And the bandwidth for this thing was fairly horrific. I mean, when the internet came out, we're talking about, tens of kilobits per second. And even in the late 90s, it was still measured in perhaps tens or even hundreds of that. If you were lucky, you might have gotten a DSL line that probably brought yourself up to about a megabit and a half per second. The point here being is that we had a new medium, the internet, and it was an open network, so not a managed network, which means everybody was just sharing bandwidth with everyone else. And we had another problem. We had MPEG-1 wasn't really good enough. MPEG-2 itself was really well optimized for managed type networks, and so we needed something new. And so this in itself was the advent of a number of new media formats that came onto the market. So a couple of new standards, proprietary standards, evolved from here. Specifically, we had majorly three major ones here in the United States. The first one was called Real Video. It was from a company called Real Networks. There's another format called Windows Media Video from Microsoft. And then Adobe had their own media called Flash Video. And some of you might, depending on Flash, is kind of dead now, but it was not predominant. It didn't go away until very recently. And Flash itself evolved through the years, but in the early days, it was based on a standard called H.263. Now, all of these in the sort of late 90s would have been considered the first streaming media formats and or protocols. And I talk about streaming compared to adaptive streaming, which we're going to hit on in a little bit. Okay? Now I'm going to touch on my company, one of my companies, for a moment here. So by the mid-90s, I had started my first startup company. It was called Osprey Technologies, and there were 5 of us, or 6 of us, I was one of 6, that co-founded this. In our early years, we were working on video compression technologies, hardware-based video compression. But by the mid to late 90s, we had transitioned over to just pure video capture. And these video capture devices were partnering with these 3 companies that I just mentioned ago to basically enable video streaming on the internet. And we did a very good job of that and became essentially the de facto standard for very streaming. Now, in the late 90s, so we're talking about like 98, 99, we had this grand idea. We're sitting around going, what if we created this like hosting site and consumers and companies could like upload their videos and share them? Isn't that, does that sound familiar to you all? Right? Well, we came out with a great product. It didn't have a great name. This was called Your Video on the Web. So here is Your Video on the Web, a shrink wrap box still. I don't know, I'm waiting for this to be worth, bazillions. But it predates YouTube by at least 5 or 6 years. Unfortunately, it was an idea way before its time. We had a parent company that didn't believe in this vision, and they ultimately sort of killed that project. So I certainly encourage you as you start your careers, if you have a vision, hold fast to them, because what could have been if, now not to say I haven't loved my career, so I never would have changed anything for the career that I'm in, but this could have been something completely different, have been doing our own YouTube back in the day. Okay, so sorry for a little side story. So now we're in about the year 2000, 2001 or 2 or something like that. And there's another transition happening, and that transition is from standard definition to high definition TV. And that was happening in parallel with this open internet, this internet thing, which is like, 1 megabit, 1.5 megabit, something like that. So this is now back over to the managed broadcast TV space, and it's transitioning from ST to HD. Now, I don't know if you know, but Raleigh, in fact, someplace not that far from here, was very famous in this regard, because the very first public HDTV broadcast in the United States was done by our own WRL right up the road, right at the corner of this is Avon Ferry and Western, right? Now, much like applications, as I've described, drive evolutions of video coding. Well, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead a little too far. So while they demonstrated this broadcast as early as 1996, it is one thing to demonstrate technology and another to get it to the point that it can actually scale. There were a lot of challenges with HD that meant size, compression, et cetera. And it was because of some of those challenges that we, as a team at my former company at Osprey, said, you know what, let's start something new. And so we started basically our second startup company in 2003. I was one of the co-founders and their CTO, and WRL was Capital Broadcasting as the parent company was one of our angel investors. So they hold a lot of dearness to our heart. Now, much like MPEG-1, as I talked about moments ago, was focused at taking video, media, and put it on a CD, we were trying to solve that same problem, except we're now a generation later, about 10 years later, looking at doing the same problem, but trying to do that with HDTV. Now, with HD format. Now, at the time, there were two different, essentially competing media discs for HD. You probably all know what this one is because of the color, right? Blu-ray disc. But I don't know if you know about what this one is. This is called HD DVD, and this was Blu-ray. But ultimately, essentially, similar technologies to some regard. But there was a challenge here, and that is the standard for video was MPEG-2, and its compression efficiencies as it relates to HD, a much larger video, just were not sufficient enough, really good enough, to fit this media, to fit these discs. And so that drove the necessity to have yet another media alternative, video compression format to MPEG-2. And so at the time, there were two different formats. There was Vc1, which happened to be already in existence. It was an extension of the Windows media format. And there was one that was just standardized in 2003 called H.264. And in many things in our space, it goes through many names. So H.264, AVC for the advanced video codec, MPEG-4 Part 10, lots of different names, different standards bodies. But again, two different options here. Now, VC1 and H.264 AVC share a lot of similarities to MPEG-2. A lot of the same coding capabilities, like going all the way back to H.261. They did have, in particular, one new interesting block, which happened to be something called a deblocking filter. So when you're compressing video, and we talked earlier about things being blocks and going through DCTs and being quantized, et cetera, that has a tendency, the fact that we're working on sort of squares or rectangles or whatever the shape happens to be, some artifacting around it. And then we use that in prediction, and then we use that in prediction, and that can cause generational loss inside of the compression space until you have a frame that doesn't use that. And so the deblocking filter acted as a means to sort of stop that, sort of clean up any of the deblocking artifacts so that you wouldn't have this propagation of these issues throughout your frames. Now, that's not the only tool. So if we take a look at VC1 and H.264, there are a whole set of tools that they have, not just, again, just this deblocking one. And these are a set of them. And again, I'd love talking about video coding. I could probably spend like an hour or two just on these set of tools alone. We don't have that time. So let's keep moving forward. I want to share this slide, though. This is comparing H.264 and VC1 sort of side by side. And the reason why I'm showing this is going to become evident in the subsequent slide that I'm going to talk about. And that there are some shared commonalities, but there are some things that are common but sort of a little bit different. So the complex loop filter versus the relatively simple loop filter. I'm going to bring a special attention to that. The entropy encoding, VLC, on the right-hand side versus the context arithmetic version on the left-hand side. And so this is a new thing that I would like to talk about, which you have two different codecs. Unlike the ones in the past, we had this one that served this space. We had 261, we had MPEG-1, we had MPEG-2. Now we're at a space that we have basically two different codecs that essentially are kind of competing with one another. And this brings in a new topic, which is lessons in viability. Lessons about what is not only viable in codecs, but also in business. But we're going to talk about it from the lens of codecs for a moment. So it turns out that codecs compressions are asymmetric, meaning the act of encoding versus the act of decoding, there's a vast difference in terms of the computations that go behind them. Compression is actually highly more complex than decoding. And when we go from one encoding generation to the next encoding generation, it's typical to find a new compression format to be anywhere of 6 to 10x more computationally complex than the previous generation, while decoders are roughly generational generation, only about 1.5, 1.2, 1.6 difference. Now, the reason why that's important here is that when we look at Vc1 compared to H.264, there was a big gap in terms of their compression complexity. And it was the fact that if I looked at the time, we're starting this business, and we looked at, well, what kind of hardware is available? You know, what is the cost of this? What are the DSPs, et cetera? What's available? What are they capable of doing? It was the fact that Vc1 was more viable. It was more technologically viable from what was available at the time, both from a compute. The compute turns into how well it's going to perform. That also has impacts on cost. So understanding the technological viability of something you're working on and the roadmaps is essential in building a business in terms of what you want to do at any given point in time. So it turns out, so at Inlet, we ended up working on Vc1. When we looked at the space, what was going to be capable, that made the most sense for us. Now, as a side note, I talked earlier on about having a number of patents in my career. So it wasn't until 1993, 94 that we filed for my first patent in my career, and it dealt specifically with how do we take and do real-time hardware-based Vc1 encoding, how we take that and distribute it across multiple different hardware units. Now, not only, I talked a moment ago about viability, there's also something else that we learned in our experience at Inlet, and that is understanding different dynamics that happen both in the industry, market dynamics, as well as technological dynamics. And understanding those and then making conscious decisions about when you might want to shift your particular strategy. And that really hit us at Inlet about 3 or so years after we started, because we found that while we were being successful on what we had chartered ourselves to do, which was real-time hardware-based Vc1 encoding for the purposes of creating media that could go on these disks, it just turned out that that market was A, pretty small, and B, some of the software capabilities and processor capabilities were kind of catching up to us. And so it didn't quite make as much sense to continue to invest in that area. And so we pivoted. We made a decision as a startup company only about 3 years in to say, you know what, we're going to pivot the majority of our business and focus on a new area. And the area we decided to go to was something that was familiar to us, the streaming space. We hadn't been visiting it since probably 2002 or so. So here 4 years later, we're deciding to kind of go back that space. But we're not going to build capture cards at this time. We're going to build solutions around these real networks and Windows Media and Adobe. And it turned out to be extremely fortuitous. If I look at sort of pivot points, inflection points in my own career, this was a big, big one. I didn't know it at the time, but it turned out to be a big one because it ultimately led Inlet into this domain of something called adaptive streaming. So what is adaptive streaming? I talked about, like in the late 90s, the evolution of the streaming space. So when we think about streaming before 2009, this is what you would experience. If I had an asset, a movie or something like that, I would encode it into multiple different bit rates, maybe a high, medium, and low. Okay, that's what I would do. I just would do that. And then you at your home, if you wanted to go watch one of these things, you'd probably go, you know what? I'm going to pick the medium rate. Or if you were really aggressive and thought you had the bomb in terms of your bandwidth to your house, you'd say, I'm going to pick the high bit rate. And so you press high, and you start to get some of the data. It starts to be progressively downloaded to you. But before playback would start, you had to have enough data. So you're sitting there, and you're waiting, and then it would start to play. Perfect, except what if none of your neighbor's network started to consume your shared bandwidth to Time Warner or whatever it happened to be, and then your bandwidth dropped? What would happen? Well, then it would kind of not have enough data to play, and it would rebuffer. Not to say you don't see that today, but this was a significant problem. So adaptive streaming ultimately was set out to address those problems, make video over the open networks more viable as a business or an opportunity. And it did so, first off, kind of similar. It would take a source asset and encode it into multiple different bit rates, variances, but it would segment that data. It would take that variances that were produced and create them into very small, maybe 4 seconds, 2 seconds, something like that, short duration assets. And so instead of having one asset that you were consuming, you had a whole bunch of small ones. So when you hit play, well, the first thing that could happen is that instead of getting the top bit rate, first off, you didn't select a bit rate. You didn't say, I want the high experience. You just said play. Usually what would happen is like one of the lower bit rates would be streamed to you first. And that meant as soon as you hit play, boom, especially if you had bandwidth, it'd start to play. So it kind of helped alleviate the startup delay. And the next thing that happened was, well, you're playing, but then if your network bandwidth changed, it would dynamically adapt. And so that reduced the possibility of having this sort of long rebuffering. Again, not to say that you as users don't experience that today, but this certainly helped quite a bit. Okay. Now, in the adaptive streaming space, much like the streaming space before it, there were a lot of competition. Okay? Competition was really good. There were 3 primary providers of adaptive streaming technology. Microsoft came out with their own called Windows Media Smooth Streaming. Apple was now a player in this space. They came up with a specification called HTTP Live Streaming. And Adobe was still in this space, and they created their own adaptive streaming format. All of these things had both protocols in terms of how it was delivered over the wire, although they all used HTTP for delivery, but then they also had different video codecs. Now, at Inlet, this is where I am at the time, we develop across all of them. And much like at Osprey, we become, again, the sort of de facto standard for providing solutions for the streaming space. Okay? And in doing so, I met often with these companies. I'd go out west, and knowing what was a benefit or a strength of one format, we would strengthen another format by not sort of telling them what to do, but encourage them that they had some weaknesses in certain areas. So competition was good by making all of these different formats stronger. So now adaptive streaming, much better than streaming before it, but now is starting to become sort of viable for an alternative. I'm going to start with that word, because I'm going to change the word up in a moment. An alternative to traditional TV providers. Okay? And I say it became viable, really it was sort of loosely viable. It was just becoming viable. And because there's a lot of stuff that still had to happen behind the scenes for it to actually become kind of like a replacement for your cable provider. So I have a statement here that says that I was an inventor, the name inventor on 15 patents over the next 5 years. And the reason why I'm doing this is only to say that this is where we needed novelty. Right? We had a new technology, adaptive streaming, but to get it to mature to the place to become an alternative to TV, a lot of continued invention and novelty had to be created. Even though we had 50-something plus years of television, none of it existed in this space for adaptive streaming. All that really existed at the beginning was I've got video and I've got audio and I just want to play that out. Okay? So giving examples of some of the things that resulted from this is that I'm powered by Major League Baseball Advanced Media and our encoders that I developed at Inlet and Cisco. There are 2 providers here in the United States that started television services. One was Sony. They launched Sony View in 2015. And then Hulu expanded their previous VOD-only service with a live TV service in 2017. Now, in addition to being an opportunity for an alternative like Hulu or Sony, the actual cable providers and satellite providers are like, we don't want to sort of lose out here. Maybe there's an alternative as well for our own services. And so the cable operators and things of that nature decided to look at adaptive streaming in earnest to see maybe there's something here. Maybe we can also play in this space as well. Much like trying to adapt this over the internet, there was a lot of work to be done here. And I was fortunate to be one of the primary and co-authors of some industry standards related to operability and specifications to help further the use of adaptive streaming for traditional TV providers. Okay, so now we're getting out of the 2000s and we're now about 2013, 2011, somewhere around there. So I was talking about adaptive streaming and the internet. Well, television is not standing still. And there's another evolution that's happening in the background, and that is UHD television, UHD video. So 4 times the resolution, potentially 2 times the pixel, the frame rate, and other aspects of it. And so that called for itself even more efficient compression algorithms. And for the last decade, we talked about how H.264 was published in 2003. It wasn't for 10 years later to 2013 that the next generation specification came out, and it's called H.265. It also goes by the name of HEVC for high efficiency video encoding. It's, again, if you look at the structure, there's a very similar structure to the things that predate it, although there are a lot of new tools that go into it. The computational complexity was, again, 6 to 10x higher than the AVC, which itself was 6x higher than the previous generation. So very similar things here, but there was one key inflection point that happened in our industry because of HEVC. And it was because of and I use this word, and I know that we're filming this live, so I use the word egregious here. But it really is, I think, kind of true. The licensing terms for HEVC were horrific. I was in a business providing solutions, looking at adopting HEVC, working on HEVC, and the licensing terms came out, and I'm like, that's it. Can't use this. This is horrific. And not only that, the patent holders that were part of the licensing pool, not all of them were part of it. And so if you wanted to use this technology, one was really concerned about, well, I know I need to pay money for some licensing here, but what about these others that might come out in other woodworks later on? So it was around these concerns that there was a fracture, there was a schism sort of in this space, the standard space, that caused a new alliance to be formed by those that said, kind of enough, we can't deal with this anymore. We can't deal with the uncertainty, we can't deal with the licensing terms. And so that was ultimately the creation of something called the Alliance for Open Media. They formed in 2015. There are a lot of founders, I name a few of them here, Cisco, Google, et cetera. And they were essentially trying to target a royalty-free video standard as an alternative to MPEG. Many of these providers, these companies submitted some of IP, royalty IP, or looked for royalty-free IP to create a standard, and ultimately they came up with one that was published in 2018 called AV1. Now, competition is good. You might have had a class that talked about monopolies, et cetera, and maybe not to suggest that MPEG itself was a monopoly, but in a sense it was. If you wanted the next video compression standard, that's where you got it from. So AV1 was a good thing in our industry because it ultimately forced the HEVC and the license body to reconsider their terms, and it became much more favorable after the fact. Okay. So now I'm going to go on to another part of career inflection for myself. So it's now 2016. Inlet had been bought by Cisco here locally. I was there for a number of years, and I decided to go work for Major League Baseball Advanced Media. Again, I could probably spend 10 or 15 minutes, you're like, baseball? You went to work for baseball? Maybe if we have time for Q&A, I can talk about baseball itself because it's an interesting history here. But yes, I went to work for Major League Baseball Advanced Media, which was empowering Hulu, was powering Sony. We were ultimately doing HBO Now, et cetera. And I was brought on, not with a specific task in mind, but ultimately charged with developing for the company our own live and VOD video transcoding solution. I put in here a little thing here. I said, no man's an island. And I want to talk about this just for a moment because I would certainly not be where I am today in my career without having associated myself with immensely talented engineers through the decades. My career success is not on my own. I stand on the shoulders of so many others. And I know as students, you work on projects and you're tasked to work with people. That is so important because in life, in your careers, you're not going to be doing things on your own. So when I started here at BAM, I was also able to bring over with me an immense amount of talent, some of it going back to 1995. I currently work with individuals that were basically with me at Osprey in 95 and 97 and all through the 2000s. In fact, the majority of our site in terms of video processing came from these previous companies that I had worked with. And I couldn't be happier. I couldn't be happier at Disney. Now, I'm not trying to use that as propaganda for going working for the Walt Disney Company, but I am going to take a moment to talk about why I love working for the Walt Disney Company a bit. And I'm going to put it in the context of the plus symbol that's in Disney Plus. I was recently at a Disney fan event, the Uber fan event. It's called D23. They host every 2 years. And so I'm talking to fans at this point, and I'm asking the fan base, like, do you know what the plus in Disney Plus stands for? No one knew the answer to that. And so I said, well, what it doesn't stand for is Disney and more stuff, right? I mean, that's what we might think, Disney and everything else. And the plus symbol is everywhere. It kind of drives me crazy. There's a service, every week there seems like there's a new service spinning up that's got X plus, X plus. Well, that's not what the plus for Disney Plus stands for. You see, it comes from Walt Disney himself. He would go and he would tell his Imagineers, plus it. He would use it as an encouraging device to say, you've got a good idea? Great, make it better, plus it. And when I speak for myself and my team, that's something that we really, really hold dearly. We're very, very passionate about upholding the quality of the Disney brand. And we're driven to always thinking about how can we do this better? How can we improve this? Whether it's for something for you that you see ultimately, or it could be for operations because we're developing solutions that are being used by other parts of the organization. How can we make this more operationally efficient? How can we make this from a business side more cost effective, et cetera? And speaking of the two Emmys, just briefly, it was very specifically about how do we do better that ultimately resulted in these Emmys. Emmys are awarded, technical Emmys are awarded for making a material impact in the industry. And there were two different things that we did as building Disney Plus because of our drive to say, yeah, we could do that, but could we do it better? That ultimately we did do something better, and that was the result of these different Emmys. Okay, let's see how we're doing on time. Not bad, 15. I'm gonna see if I can get through some of this stuff really quickly here, so we have time for Q&A. So I'm now gonna transition a little bit and talk about some machine learning now, what we're doing in the business and also in the future. And I wanted to start off with a reflection of something that happened to me personally a little over 30 years ago. So now I'm back at NC State, fall of 1991, and I'm taking my first neural networks class. And I was creating a neural networks that did image reconstruction, repair of images, of text actually. And I was doing it by using context effects of things that were surrounding it. And we were invited as a class to go over to Chapel Hill and present in front of some students and professors. And I'm doing that, I'm finishing my presentation, and a professor raises his hand, asks a question. He said, why are you doing this? We already have things that do this already. They do it okay. Why are you trying to reinvent the wheel? Now, honestly, I can't remember what I did, I don't even know if I answered the question because I certainly wasn't prepared for it. Well, I'm much wiser now. I would have had a much better answer at the time. And now I'm going to take this and reflect this back to video compression. As we talked about the coding and things of the last 30 years, one thing that you might have got a sense of, I said over and over again, it's like a variation of a thing. We did this, and then we did a little bit more of this, and then the images got better, and we did this, et cetera. And it just kept kind of repeating and repeating and repeating. And we've been very successful at that, but we're really at the limits of what we can do in terms of this repetitive nature of refining these codecs. We need to find different ways to compress. Not only that, we talked about the computational complexity. I talked about how there was a standard in 93 and then one in 13. Well, they're happening much, much faster. We went from 13 to 18 to 21. So the evolution of technology and how we can apply it in compression is happening so fast that the computation that's available, we think of Moore's Law, et cetera, is not happening fast enough. We can't get these things, I've got a new format, and it's now running at 0.02 frames per second. It's too complex. I don't have the computational hardware to do it. And so not only are we looking at, say, machine learning to address things in the compression space, but we're also beginning to use it as ways to influence the existing compression pipeline, different ways and different techniques to help address some of these computational problems. Okay. I threw up this slide. You don't really need to read it in terms of the different sort of patent filings, but this just sort of gives you a sense of, for myself and team, and this extends globally through the US, throughout the world. We have a fantastic research team based in Zurich, Switzerland. And these are just a number of the different machine learning-based patents just applied to the compression pipeline that we've done in just the last couple of years. Not only, and we talked a lot tonight about compression, but we're also using machine learning completely outside of the compression domain. So my team has got 3 current projects where there's a lot of ML work. The top left one deals with trying to characterize content. We've got all these, our library in Disney Plus, for example, is tens of thousands of assets, and we think globally there are even more, and they're very diverse. And we want to do a better job of compressing them, and we think, and we know that if we understand the characteristics of the content, we might be able to do a better job. So that top left one is about how do we develop networks to discern characteristics from content to drive. The far right one has to deal with maybe utilizing machine learning or ML and networks for doing a better job of some of the traditional things we used to do. Like we have all these scaling algorithms, but we think we can do a better job by utilizing completely different techniques. The bottom left one is sort of near and dear to my heart because we just started this project. So it's going to be a 3-year project. Early in my career, I was dealing with video, and the audio and video wouldn't be in sync with each other. They'd be off. And I remember telling my colleagues, you know, when I turn 50, if I'm still dealing with audio-video sync problems, I quit. I'm going to become a monk. I'm going to give it all up. And now I'm saying that it's actually a testimony to the Walt Disney Company, how much I'm enjoying it, that I'm still working because I am over 50, and I'm still dealing with these darn audio-video sync problems. So, however, but for the first time in my career, because it's been like 30 years of this, we're now we're looking into this deeply. We're trying to use ML networks to analyze audio, analyze the shape of the mouth, doing face detection, looking at the shape of the mouth. What is an audio sound? What is the phonetics of that? What does the shape of the mouth look like? And then is that the shape of the mouth when that audio piece, and are they close to each other? Or if they're not, how far apart in time they are? And then developing some other things to help correct that. So it's kind of pretty cool and pretty exciting. Now, I've got another little deck that I could flip through really quick, because I can stay a little bit longer for Q&A. So do you think? Because this other one has a couple of really cool things I'd like to show you. So let me quit this one. And let's see here. I'm going to bring this guy up. I'm going to hit play. Come here, bad boy. Play. OK. So I am going to go through this relatively quickly, so not with the diligence that I had hoped to this evening. But I want to share with you a couple of, again, ML-based video processing, not so much compression things, but processing projects that have been happening within the Walt Disney Company, and also a little bit what's happening with my team. So the first one goes into something called audience understanding. So for the Walt Disney Company that creates stories, television shows or whatever, understanding the audience reaction, is this, do they like it? Do they don't like it? How are they reacting? Are they crying in the right place, et cetera, is really important. And the way this used to be done is you do it with surveys. You watch something and then they fill out a piece of paper. What'd you think? And then there was a technique that we used these dials. So they're watching content. Oh, yeah, ooh, scary. Nope, this, and they're turning this thing, right? OK, interesting enough. Well, the thing that is happening now is something we call unconscious dial tuning. It's a multidisciplinary effort across computer vision, machine learning, and psychology. And in essence, let's see if we can get this guy started. This takes a little part of it, kind of goes to that sort of facial recognition, trying to understand facial recognition's emotions, et cetera, whether it's pleasure or displeasure, et cetera. Are they being miserable? Are they angry? There's all these different things on the right-hand side there. And ultimately, we're trying to assess, does their reaction match the creative intent of the stories we're telling? So this was something done with the rookie. And there were some interesting findings that we find at times, because at times there are aspects of where the intent matches the audience reaction, and sometimes not. Like we might have something that is set up to be a scary sequence, but actually is meant for comic relief. And so you get kind of a divergence between what the video is showing versus what the reaction is to the actual audience itself. Okay? This particular slide here is showing upscale. Let's see how well it translates here. So taking content and using machine learning to do super upscaling. And this is in a variety of different applications within the business. Okay? In this particular shot here, we're looking at taking existing content that was produced perhaps generationally ago and providing a better experience for our consumers. So instead of taking what existed on the left and delivering that to you, that's what exists, that's what was authored at the time, how do we clean that stuff up? And so there's a whole lot of processing, deep scaling stuff that's going on there. This one is called Project Lizzie. So I don't know if any of you, when you were younger, you watched the Lizzie McGuire shows in the 2000s, maybe some of you. So Lizzie McGuire is an asset that has a little bit of interlacing going on, but then it's got this interesting characteristics that some things are interlaced within the frames and some things are not. And so this is part of a project of catalog enhancement, going back to the existing catalog and applying ML techniques for ultimately improving the quality. I'm going to flip through these really, really quick, these next 3 slides. These are all from academia, so these don't actually represent work that was done within the company, but it's work that was leading towards addressing this audio-video sync problem. So often when we are faced with a new problem like AV sync, we go to academia, like, well, what is the latest? What's being done? We read papers. And is there something there that might be applied in this space? So in this particular place, this next couple of slides was used for something called audio-driven video synthesis. And so the purpose was how do you take someone that's me on stage here, and it's got my mouth and I'm talking, but maybe you want to have this as an example in French. Now, normally what you do is you'd have a dub and someone speaking French, but if you're watching it, it's still Mr. Labrozzi here speaking in English, and he's hearing this thing in French, and it's kind of like disturbing, right? So if we can take basically and understand the spoken language, and able to do some audio expression analysis to what is that language and what is the shape of that, and then we can take basically the real person's face, it's almost like, like a deep fake, but in the audio and the visual space. So how do we morph that person's face to give you the impression that they're actually saying something that they actually didn't say? Now, I must say at this moment that within the Walt Disney Company, we take ethics really high. And so, and it's really important, and we've got training material on it. So, utilizing such techniques for I don't want to nefarious reasons we really protect what we're doing here in the technology, because we don't want to be used for wrong purposes. Okay, so I'm going to flip to the last slide of the evening, and then maybe we have a few minutes for a question. So this is an example. Let's see if it plays out and you could hear it.
You can apply this filter for each of these billboards. So this creates an initial smoothing. However, you are still left with a problem that there are inconsistencies in the geometry. So we are applying this on the geometry on this parity between the views from the individual cameras. And in order to filter across all different billboards, we do the following. Think of this as being the central view, and think of this bluish circle being the stencil.
I'm not sure how well that translated to you in the audience, but what was going on here is that this is Marcus Gross, he leads our Disney research team in Zurich. This was him speaking at a conference. So he gave a conference speaking. And then we used Marcus's talking at a completely different conference and then mapped it onto here. So the one on the right-hand side was basically him speaking with the normal dialogue, and the one on the left-hand side was the action that I showed in the pre-slides, basically changing the shape of his mouth to match the spoken language, was not what he actually did at this particular conference. Now, there may be other needs and reasons for having that within the technology of the Walt Disney Company. I don't know how many of you have watched maybe The Mandalorian. You saw some really cool stuff there in terms of young Luke Skywalker and things like that. That's a completely different application, but you could think of other applications where we want to have maybe the spoken language meet a particular character, whether it's a real character or a synthetic character's voice. We, as part of Disney Streaming, are utilizing it for this application, but are using some of the fundamental components here to think about how we might solve this audio-video sync problem. In any event, pretty close. We've got 5 minutes left. That's the end of my presentation for this evening. Welcome to take any questions here for the next couple of minutes, and then I'll certainly stay afterwards if you want to come up to me personally and ask some questions.
So Scott, I'll just say, if anybody has a question, if you'll speak as loudly as you can, but since you have the microphone that they can hear on the online, if you could just paraphrase the question.
Absolutely. Yes, Doctor.
Great talk, very exciting. You showed the super resolution upscaling application. It looks very cool. I just wondering whether that technology is applied. What scenario, what devices do you apply that? I would think that probably could run offline on the server to do some enhancement of videos. But are you also using it in real time?
Right. So the question is about the super resizing. And offline versus online real time. So it's certainly the case that a lot of the techniques, or most of the things that you saw this evening, are not real time, and they are used offline. The primary use case there are many use cases, but one of the primary use cases that we see for the upscaling is having some film, some asset that might have been done 20, 30 years ago, likely potentially in a smaller resolution, or especially if it was a television broadcast material, and giving you as an audience a better, newer experience and upscaling it to HD. Or UHD, even beyond that. Okay? Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah. You talked about the AV1 codec that was published recently. I don't know if you saw it, but Intel's new graphics card that they just released includes AV1 in their thing, and they say it's as a direct competition to H.264. Do you have any thoughts on how much performance it should
Yeah, well, certainly AV1 and HEVC, or 265, are relatively close in terms of encoding performance, and so both of those would supersede, say, AVC clearly. So it might have been more correct to say AV1 is a maybe competitor to HEVC, okay? And that's certainly the case. I mean, but there is for us as a business, we talked about viability early on. Not only what can we do in terms of our business is something viable to do. So AV1 potentially is more complex in some regard if you use it to its full extent than HEVC. But a bigger challenge for us is the deployment, right? So we want to use, let's say, AV1 to all of you, but do your devices support AV1, right? Do your TVs, et cetera, support AV1? And so that's something we think about as a business all the time, because it is expensive for me to encode in AV1 and HEVC and AVC and all these things. And as a business, we want to reach as many consumers as possible. And so we will probably be doing AVC, which you saw in there, H.264, that was standardized in 1993, probably for another 10 plus years. It'll have a very, very long tail. And that's because the breadth of devices, we're holding onto our devices longer, et cetera. They may only support a particular class of video. So we have to think about not only what is the ecosystem support, but what is the cost of the business to support something. And so often it's the case we look at the trade-offs. It's like, okay, it may be better, but is it better enough to offset the costs that might be associated with doing an additional format? So there's a lot of aspects, business aspects that come into our decisions, deployment aspects, technology aspects, performance aspects, et cetera. One thing we didn't really cover this evening in the talk is that there's a wide range in terms of quality of a particular encoder. We talked about like the art, right? So one could use, and I'm not saying anything specifically about Intel because they're a great partner with us, but you could do an AV1 implementation that in itself is not that much different than the HEVC implementation. Or you could put more investment, more in silicon, you can do more of the tools. And so there's a wide range of applications. And not only that, maybe as a consumer, a particular implementation of AV1 might be good enough for you as a consumer, but is it good enough for us as a business where our quality is really high? Now we could achieve that, but in order to do so, we're gonna have to spend a lot of compute cycles to achieve that. Okay. All right.
All right. So thank you very much.
Thank you.